Hello. Week 6 is going to be on environmental observation and interviews. So we're going to start by looking at what are environmental observations. So these kinds of observations are observations of the classroom setting and the classroom environment. And we do these observations in order to determine how the environment or the classroom setting supports learning and promotes development for the children in the classroom. So in order to do environmental observations, we could focus on a few things. We can focus on the layout and lighting of the classroom. And by layout, we mean the flow of the classroom. So how easy is it to move from one area of the classroom to another? And the lighting, we're looking at the intensity of the lighting. So some children and some adults, for that matter, are very sensitive to lighting. And sometimes when we have either fluorescent light or LED light in the classroom that is all unnatural light, the intensity of this light can cause either headaches or could stimulate aggressive behavior or passive behavior. So the intensity of the light will set the mood or the tone for some of the interactions. So it's important to look at this. And this is something that we typically don't think about when we think about classrooms, but the lighting is going to be important because, again, for some, it's a matter of sensitivity, but in general, it's a matter of sort of setting the mood or setting the tone in the classroom. If you look at Montessori classrooms, the color scheme and the lighting and the colors used in the lighting in the classroom are going to be very important. And they're going to determine if they're warm tones versus cool tones versus sort of pastel colors or bright primary colors. They're going to determine the energy level in the classroom. So that's something important to look at when we're doing environmental classroom observations to see how that is playing out in the room. Another thing that we look at is the equipment and the furniture. So we look at how the furniture and the different equipment, large equipment in the classroom is placed, and if that is placed in a way that is impeding the accessibility from one area to the other, or it's interrupting the visibility. So you want to be able, as a teacher, from any point where you're standing in the classroom to see the entire room. So to make sure that the equipment and the furniture are not blocking your view and that they're not areas or workstations in the classroom that are sort of hidden in which children could be out of view and maybe getting into trouble or difficult situations or maybe dangerous situations and that you can't see them. So that's important to look at. And lastly, we look at materials. So the actual educational materials or play materials that you have in the classroom. You want to be aware or make sure that these materials don't present, say, a choking hazard for children, or that the quality of the material is a high quality so that they're not going to break, and then the little pieces might represent a choking hazard or might represent a piece that might splinter or that might cut the child or the children in any way, right? So you want to check the materials for quality, but you also want to see where the materials are placed for accessibility. So you want materials to be that are available for children to use, to be at a height that children can access them without the help of the adult, so that this will increase independence and autonomy in the child and will not necessitate an adult to be there to help the child to attain or grab the material that they're looking for. So in a pre-K classroom, and we're focusing on pre-K this week in terms of pre-K development and all the different areas of development, And so we're looking at if we were going to do an environmental observation in a pre-K classroom, we would find that typically a pre-K classroom is organized in centers or play areas. And when we're talking about pre-K, we're talking about children between the ages of 3 and 5. So it could be a room for 3s, a room for 4s, a room for 5s, this age group that is before the children enter kindergarten. Or it could be a mixed age group where you have children from 3 to age 5 in the same room, right? Looking at this map of this classroom, you can see that there are certain areas or centers that are typically found in a typical pre-K classroom, like the block center, the dramatic play area, the art center, or areas where you have easels or art materials. And there's some other areas that, and then the fine motor or manipulatives area is also very typical. There are other areas that you might find in a pre-K classroom if the classroom is big enough to hold them, or might not, like the sensory area, the science and discovery area, the quiet area, which is going to be really important. And then if you look at classrooms, pre-K classrooms that are more focused on curriculum areas such as math and English language arts, then you're going to see that they might have a math area or a math table, and they might have a writing and listening or reading corner, right? It depends on the size of the room, and it depends on how the teacher has organized it and what the curriculum that the teacher is using dictates that needs to be available for the children. There is typically always a whole group instruction area or a whole group meeting area that is delineated typically with a rug. So children come together on the rug, and the teachers hold the morning meetings or the end of the day meetings, or they do whole class instruction there. But the majority of the time, if you look at the class schedule for a pre-K classroom, the majority of the time should be dedicated for children to be playing and interacting with the materials in the different play areas or play centers. In this one, in particular, you can see that there's coat lockers that are inside of the room, and then there's cots that are inside of the room as well. These then let us know that children take naps in the room, they use the cots for sleeping, and that they have all of their personal belongings in the classroom as well and in the lockers. This particular classroom also has a computer area, which is also an optional area, and typically children will go there either individually to play with the computers or in pairs with a peer. That's also something that's not necessarily in every pre-K classroom, but this particular one has it. And this one has something that's really great to have in a classroom, is it has the bathroom inside the classroom. So the children don't have to leave the classroom accompanied by an adult to go to the bathroom. They can go to the bathroom, and the adult-child ratio can be preserved. Okay, so let's move now to observation and assessment technique number 3, which is interviews. So we looked at anecdotal records, was the first technique that we looked at. We looked at work samples, was the second technique that we looked at, and now technique number 3 is interviews. So when you think about interviews, you might think about a job interview or the interviews that you do with participants in a research study to collect data. Those are not the interviews that we're talking about here. Here we're talking about interviews as an assessment technique in which teachers use probing questions. So they ask questions to the children, as you would in a typical interview, but you're using them to probe and to push their thinking. And there's a couple of purposes of why we do this, but one is to support learning. So to advance the way children are thinking about a particular topic, to stretch their critical thinking process, and to support the way they're learning about a particular topic. The other purpose is to gauge or assess learning. So to be able to know what and how much the children know. So we're asking questions to see how they're thinking, to see what they know, to assess and evaluate them. And we also use interviews with these probing questions to aid in development progress. So to support that development to continue to progress. So we said the interviews are basically questions that we come up with to ask the children for these different purposes that I just mentioned. So what kinds of questions can we ask? We can ask factual questions, and factual questions are closed questions that have one answer, one correct answer, and that have a correct answer, right? So they have one single correct answer, and they're typically closed questions. And an example is, can you tell me what's the name of this shape? So you show a geometrical shape to the child, and you ask the child to identify the name of that particular shape, right? So there's only one correct answer to that question, and the child will either get it right or get it wrong. Those are factual questions. Reasoning questions are different than factual questions because they draw on logic or sequential thought. They promote critical thinking. So they're looking to expand the way children think. They're looking to encourage the child to think back logically on what they know in order to respond to that question. So an example is, what do you think might happen if we add oil to this mixture? So we're asking the child to make an inference, to hypothesize, to think logically in order to respond to that particular question. And those are reasoning questions. Those questions might have a correct answer or might not, but they, in essence, what they do is they encourage critical thought or critical thinking. Open-ended questions are questions that, different from the factual questions that are closed, these are open in the sense that there is no one right answer or anticipated answer. So if you're asking the question, you don't already know what the answer is. The answer can be a multitude of answers. So there's no one answer that is going to be correct, and you might not even have an inkling or can imagine what that answer might be. So for example, how can we make this tower taller, right? Or how can we make this structure be more balanced? And have the child come up with ideas. So open-ended questions also promote critical thinking. And you're going to see that reasoning questions, open-ended questions, critical thinking questions, and what we're going to talk about next, higher order questions, tend to all be sort of the same. They promote critical thinking, they're open, they don't have one correct or right answer, and they encourage the child to think. Social questions, on the other hand, are questions that are inviting children to share their experiences, their feelings, their emotions, and sometimes teachers use these questions to manage behavior. So to think about, why is it that we're not getting along? Why is it that we always have this tantrum at the end of the day? And talk through with the children and have the children engage in those conversations to tease out why these things, behavioral issues, are occurring, right? So an example would be, if you ask the child, how do you feel when another child says something nice to you? So it's looking at having the child reflect on their feelings, on their emotions. It's also, social questions are also used to help the child practice using their words to make evident their emotions. Okay, so high-level questions. Again, high-level questions can be critical thinking questions, reasoning questions, open-ended questions. So they are never a yes or no question. So if you can answer the question with yes or no, it's not a high-level question. It's never a question that has an obvious answer. So it's a reasoning question, a critical thinking question, an open-ended question where there can be a multitude of answers that can be given and they would be correct. And it's never a question that has only one answer or one correct answer, right? It is always a question that each child will answer in his or her own way. So the answers can be very personalized. It will always encourage children to expand their thinking and perspective on a particular subject. So these are the kinds of questions that make the children think, that make the children think beyond the obvious, right? So using their critical thinking skills, using their prior knowledge, they're making the child think about it, maybe even in a different kind of way and from a different perspective. And these kinds of questions should always be developmentally appropriate for the age and the stage of the individual child or the children that you're asking this question to, because you can have a high level question that is asked to a group of children, right? So you can ask these kinds of questions in a meeting or a whole group instruction activity. But it needs to be developmentally appropriate for the child or for the children that you're asking the question to. Okay, so let's see these two examples of high-level questions. So number one, and these are questions that maybe I can ask you as a student of child development, right? So what are 3 things that you know about the way young children learn? Right? So I could ask you that question, and it's a high-level question. It's open-ended. You can respond it in a way, and your peer can respond it in a different way. So it doesn't have one correct answer. It doesn't have one unique answer, and it'll make you think. But this other question also is a high-level question, but it's going to make you think in a different way. So how would you design a collage that shows the most important things about the way young children learn? So what do you notice when you compare these two questions? One obvious thing is that one question, or question number 1, is asking you to recall what you know and state 3 of those things, right? Question number 2 is also asking you to recall what you know, but now taking what you know, how can you now create a new and different way in which you can convey those things that you know about child development or the way children learn and explain it to someone else or present it to someone else? So the first question is going to be at a level of remembrance or recall, and the second question is going to be at a higher level of creating something new. So they're both high-level questions. It's just that one question, number 2, is at a higher level than question number 1. And we'll see that we talked about Bloom's taxonomy a bit last week when we were looking at student learning objectives, or SLOs, right? So we have the original Bloom's taxonomy has these 6 levels that go from knowledge to comprehension to application to analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Well, Anderson and Krathwohl modified Bloom's taxonomy and changed a little bit the names of each of the levels of the taxonomy. So knowledge now is called remember, comprehension is understand, application is apply, which is in essence the same thing, as is analysis and analyze. But synthesis now is evaluate, and evaluation now is create. And you're going to see that when you develop learning objectives or when you think about questions, you can use Bloom's taxonomy to guide you at what level of difficulty that learning objective or those questions are. And so this is a really good guide to have to when you're writing learning objectives and when you're thinking about writing higher order questions or high level questions. So this is a book that was published by NACCE, and I'll have the references towards the end, in which they took this modified Bloom's taxonomy and give us an example of what kinds of verbs we would use in a learning objective. And because the learning objective is at that level, using that particular verb, then what kinds of questions could we ask? So if we look at the first step or the first level of remember, we'll see that in the white rectangle over here, we see examples of verbs. So children will identify, will name, will count, will repeat, will recall, right? So if our learning objective is children will identify the names of 3 animals, what kinds of questions could we ask the children to help them meet that learning objective? So an example here is, what animal is this? That is a kind of question that is at the remember level that matches the remember level at which that learning objective is at. When we say children will identify at least 3 names of different animals. So if we compare, for example, to evaluate, which is a higher level of high-level questions over here, we would see that the types of verbs that we would use in a learning objective would be express opinion, judge, defend, criticize, right? So you would write your learning objective as children will express their opinion about the animals that we should have in the classroom, for example, if we continue with the animal theme. And then a question that you would ask if you had that evaluate level of learning objective would be, what are some reasons why this animal would or wouldn't make a good pet for us in this classroom, right? So that would be a question that doesn't have necessarily one correct answer, that doesn't have an expected response that you can anticipate, and that allows the children to think, to use their critical thinking skills and tell you many different reasons why or why not that animal would make a good pet. So you see that the verbs that we have here would be the behavior component of the learning objective. So if you remember the A, B, C, D formula that we talked about last week, you will see that the B is the behavior, and the behavior is represented by a verb. So they're giving you here examples of what kinds of verbs you would use depending on the level of Bloom's taxonomy or the modified Bloom's taxonomy that you are using. So if you're using remember, these would be examples of verbs. If you're using understand, these would be examples of verbs, and so on. It could also help you if you write a learning objective to then do it in the opposite direction. So instead of saying, okay, I want to have the children understand, so these are the verbs that I'm going to be using in my learning objectives, and then design a learning objective, you can do it in the reverse order. You can write a learning objective and then determine what the verb is, and then go back to a table like this and say, okay, if this is my verb, what level of the taxonomy am I using? And because I'm at that level, then what kind of questions can I ask? And then you develop your questions that you're going to ask during your lesson for the children so that everything matches, everything is at the same level. Because it's not fair to say, okay, well, the objective is at the remember level, but I'm going to start asking questions at the evaluate level. It doesn't match, right? You're not helping the child reach the objective if you're not matching the questions that you're asking with a particular objective that you have for that lesson if you're not matching the level of or the degree of difficulty of the questions with the degree of difficulty of the learning objective. So for activity 2, what you're going to do is you're going to start developing interview questions. And I'm going to ask you to write 4 questions and in parentheses determine what level of difficulty they are. So if it's a remember question, if it's a create question, if it's an evaluate question, or so on, put it in parentheses. So write your question, put the level in parentheses, and then think about when in the daily schedule or the class period or in which play area or play center would you ask this question? Would this be a great question to ask the whole class during morning meeting, or would it be a question that is asked for a particular child in, say, while they're in the dramatic play area or the block center, working maybe by themselves or with a couple of other children? And think about, use the developmental area that you were assigned for activity 1 in order to, with that same development area in mind, think about, okay, what questions could I ask if I'm working with cognitive development? What questions could I ask that would promote and support the cognitive development of the children? And what level of complexity or what level in the taxonomy would that question fall under? And in which area or period of the daily schedule would be best to ask that question? So complete this. You are going to have this worksheet in the discussion board for activity 2, and then post it there, and remember to also comment on at least one of your classmates' posts. Okay, so these are the references that I used. The Stracer and Bresson Big Questions for Young Minds is the book that I mentioned before, where that ladder of, or that steps for the different levels of high order questions came from. That's published by NAEYC. And these are the other 2 references that I used. So to wrap up for week 6, the homework is you need to complete observation assignment 2 using the work sample template. Establish your learning objective, present the sample that you collected from your focal child and the interpretation that you made, developmental interpretation that you made of that sample, and submit it onto Blackboard. Read from the Developmentally Appropriate Practices book, pages 111 to 183 that focus on preschool development. Then read other required and recommended readings for week 6 that are all under readings under week 6 on Blackboard, and then complete the discussion boards for activity 1 and activity 2, which is the activity that we talked about here in this presentation. And that is it. You should be set for all the activities that we need to do for week 6.